The Mindset Advantage, a podcast by Arcadia Consulting, architects of change.
The anticipation or dread in the transition between the past and the future when a change is anticipated needs to be managed, just as much as the mindset response to the change once it's announced. Today, Jennifer Haddad is joined with leadership and change consultant Donna Hamilton to explore the stage of pre-change anticipation and what strategies can be put in place to set the future up for success.
Welcome back to the Mindset Advantage podcast series. My name is Jenny and I'm a consultant at Arcadia Consulting. Joining me today to talk about the pre-anticipation stage of change is Donna Hamilton, a highly experienced leadership and change consultant and director of Cheval Rouge, enabling performance through people. Welcome, Donna. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you for inviting me.
Great. Would you like to start by telling our listeners a little bit more about yourself, Donna, and your experience?
Yeah, so I'm Donna Hamilton. I'm director of Cheval Rouge. I'm proud to say that I'm a fellow with the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. For the last 25 years, I've been working in people and change in various guises. 20 years inside large organisations, performing senior HR roles in large FTSE 100 companies. And for the last 5 years, I've had great fun consulting with a range of private sector, public sector, voluntary sector organisations all around the world, but all focused on people and change. And outside of work, I'm a stepmom, a granny, a wife, and owner of 2 horses.
Aha, the name for Cheval Rouge suddenly became apparent.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Donna. It sounds like this is certainly the right topic for you to discuss based on your experience with lots of organisations. Today we are here to talk about a stage of the change process that happens prior to any change actually occurring. I'm personally no stranger to change, having moved country no less than 3 times in the space of the last 5 years. But the anticipation or dread in the moment between the old and the new can bring about its own range of emotions. Donna, would you like to explain a bit more about this stage of the change cycle?
Yeah, when you first asked me to come along and talk about it, I was intrigued because we spend a lot of time thinking about the implementation of change. But you're absolutely right, this anticipation period is really, really important. So what do we mean? So it's essentially that moment where you become aware that change is going to happen. So at an organisational level, it might be you have a new chief executive, perhaps a merger or an acquisition's been announced. You know that the organisation's having financial difficulties and is going to have to make some changes. Or it could be at a much more local level. So there's new ways of working, new systems, new technology, new team leads. So you know that change is going to happen. It's inevitable, but you don't yet know what it means for you or your role. And that can result in one of 2 things. So we could be optimistic, we could be fine about it, but it's much more likely that we'll treat that absence of information, the anticipation of change as a negative thing, as a fearful thing. And that can often result in a fight, flight, or freeze response.
Right. So that stage and those concerns, how does that tend to look like? How does that tend to play out from a leadership perspective?
I think I typically see leaders displaying one of 3 behaviours in this scenario. So they might hide, they might try and avoid the conversation. They become noticeably absent from the team or avoid any conversations about it. They can also sort of step into the team. So as victims of that change, as people who are likely to be impacted by the change, they might join in and say, well, I don't know what it means. I don't know what's going to happen. So they're absenting themselves from the conversation. Or sometimes they go the other way, usually in a well-meaning attempt to reassure employees. They're making up the narrative. They're filling the void. So they're making assurances and promises that they're really not in a position to make.
Right. And then from a team's perspective, if the leaders are behaving like that, how might this early stage of change pan out for team members?
Well, I think we see a wide range of behaviours and responses. So I said earlier, some employees embrace change. They love it. They don't like things staying the same for too long. But for others, it can be a very anxious time. They can be very fearful about the future. It can severely impact resilience and well-being. I have seen really talented people leave organisations during this phase because they're proactively looking for another job rather than waiting to see what might happen to them. And equally, I see sometimes individuals and whole organisations freeze. So they do nothing. They think it's futile. As an example, I used to be the HR business partner for a large technology function, and this function had a reputation for restructuring every 18 months or so. And in the end, nobody really paid attention to the achievement of project goals or long-term plans because they'd all just become so used to everything changing, performance measures, line managers, leaders, structures, everything changing before they ever got to the end of a project or program of work. So it can be really impactful on both individual and organisational performance.
Right. So sometimes it's partly to do with whether this is the first time that they've gone through this change, and that fear of the complete unknown would play out in terms of stress and anxiety, I guess.
Yeah, I think both can be debilitating. So if it's not something you're familiar with, it might be something you're very fearful of. So we see that in organisations that have had the status quo for a very long time. But equally, if you work in an organisation that's constantly changing, it can be very disorienting that you don't know what's going to happen next. And you can have that feeling that it's not worth investing time and effort into something which is likely to change. The goalposts are likely to change again.
That makes a lot of sense. So if employees are ultimately left in the dark at this stage, how does that affect them in the longer term when the change actually occurs?
I think if we all reflect, when we've been in similar situations, either in working life or in personal life, there are a number of areas of our lives that can be threatened by change. David Rock sums it up very nicely in his SCARF model. So the S of SCARF is for status, C is for certainty, A is for autonomy, R is for relatedness, and F is for fairness. So he talks about, when we're facing into change, we're thinking about changes to our status. So will we still have the same relative social position in the team? Will we have the same number of direct reports? Will we have the same span of control? Will we have the same decision-making authority, the same budgets? Will we still report to the same level of the organisation? So status is certainly one. Certainty, so having the ability to predict what might happen, having the ability to picture ourselves in a routine, again, is something that can be threatened by change. One of the biggest issues that I see and something that I find very hard to deal with is a loss of control, a loss of autonomy. So being worried about the extent to which you'll have a choice about what happens to you, how you can participate in the change, what the change will ultimately mean for you, how free you will be to operate going forward can be really important. And equally, relatedness. So relatedness describes how the change might affect our relationships. So will you still have the same colleagues? Will you still have the same direct reports? Will you still have the same relationships internally, externally with suppliers? Will you still report to the same people? And then finally, fairness. So the extent to which you believe that the change will be fair and equitable and equally handled for all.
That's an interesting model. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good model for leaders to think about if they want to put themselves in the shoes of the individuals who are impacted by change. Also helpful for us as individuals to understand why we might be feeling the way we are about change.
And then if it goes uncommunicated of what the actual change is during this early stages, do you think people tend to make up their own version of what might be happening? Do they call it gossiping, call it, speculating? But I guess that's another human reaction when they don't know something, is to create the story themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So prospect theory says that we're twice as likely to be fearful and negative about change if we don't know what's going to happen. So it's really up to leaders to own that narrative. But yeah, absolutely. We'll spend a lot of time projecting into the future, worrying what might happen, and worrying about what could happen can be as emotionally stressful as things actually happening. So yeah, so it's really important not to leave people to their own devices and make up stories and gossips in the middle.
So on that note, what information or advice can you give leaders on how to manage this period of change, and what can they be doing to make it go a bit smoother?
So I think I'd sum it up as disciplined care. So the care bit is about, being empathetic, being supportive, recognizing that this is a period of change and that people might be feeling anxious about it. So it's really important that you increase the frequency and connection with teams and also one-to-ones. it's very likely that you'll probably have a good sense of who in your team's more likely to embrace change and who in your team is going to likely to find it a little bit more difficult and might need a little bit more care and attention. Equally, don't forget that factors outside of work can affect our ability to embrace change. So just because I'm usually quite adaptable doesn't mean to say that for this particular change, I'm going to perform the same. It's about really actively listening to people's concerns without diminishing them, explaining them away, giving them false reassurances. So spending lots of time asking open questions, asking how they feel about change. And it's about empathy. It's about understanding colleagues' very real jeopardy, what they're concerned about. And to your point, when you're hearing gossip or speculating, it's just trying to control the narrative and shut that down. Not in a dismissive way, but just accepting that we don't know the answers to that yet and swiftly move on.
And rather than pretending that they know the answer, to possibly own up to the fact that they don't yet know how this is going to play out, but they can understand why people are feeling anxious about it.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think just being authentic, admitting that you don't currently know, but as soon as you do, you'll share, and equally empathizing that can be unsettling, and understanding that is really important. Important to be vulnerable as a leader, I think.
Yeah, very important.
And then the disciplined part of disciplined care is really about focusing people's attention on short-term performance. So we might not know what the future looks like, but what do we know? What deadlines do we have? What projects do we need to deliver? What are the aspects that we can control? And really pivot conversations to the things that people can control, focus the team on clear short-term goals, and prioritize those short-term deliverables. And I think something else that you can do in this stage is really just get the team ready for change. So, what housekeeping needs to be done? What spring cleaning needs to be done? Are there things that you can do to help the team be prepared and ready for the change? Whether it's documenting roles, documenting systems, processes. What can you do to be ready?
And that's almost involving them more then, isn't it? Rather than it being an external thing, that gets them emotionally involved in the change.
Yeah, so it's rather than mourning the past or speculating about the future, it's really focusing their attention on the here and now. What can they do? What can they control?
As much as this is all about leadership and the workplace, I can't help but relate it to my personal scenarios as a mum of two almost teenagers who I've moved across the world several times. And I think my default position in all those scenarios was to sort of shield them from it. I'll deal with it all. I'll figure out how it's going to look and how it's going to work. And then when I know, I'll tell you. But it almost, in hindsight now, gives them a lot less chance to deal with it. And not getting involved doesn't allow them to feel like they've made an impact themselves in it. So hopefully I haven't ruined them too much with that. But it is an interesting one that I think plays out both personally and at work, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So you can imagine them thinking, going back to that scarf model. So, what will my social status be in my new class? What will I be doing every day? What choice will I have about where I go to school and what subjects I do? Will I make new friends? You can see how it relates to all aspects of life.
Is there anything else that we haven't covered on this important change? I know that this is the pre-anticipation change, the podcast series, The Mindset Advantage, is talking about all the different stages of dealing with change. So this is quite an early one. But is there anything that we haven't touched on that would either be quite important for the people going through it or for the leaders that are taking people through it?
I think, first of all, would be just don't underestimate the importance of it. I think if you get this stage right, you can really set people up to be successful through the other stages of change. But equally get it wrong, you're going to make it much less likely that people are going to get through the change, much less likely that they'll do it quickly, and they're likely to go far deeper down into the despair phases of the change curve. So I would say don't neglect it as a phase of the change process. It's fundamental.
So I think, Donna, what we've talked about is a lot of these change projects that are pretty planned. They're for a reason within a business or for a reason of a move, but either way, they're being pre-planned. What about change that happens unplanned, that maybe perhaps at the start of the pandemic, which just something is happening to us? What would you say that happens in this scenario and how best to deal with it?
I think that's a great example of when disciplined care really comes to the fore. So I do a lot of employee listening, employee feedback projects, and I was working with a very big telecommunications company last year when the pandemic hit, and they literally sent 2,000 contact centre workers home overnight. They still had a presence in the front line and retail outlets and engineering staff who were having to potentially deal with COVID positive customers. And the disciplined care during that phase was really, really important. So this was unprecedented. Nobody had the answers. There wasn't a blueprint or a plan as to how to do it. But we really saw through employee listening that the things that made a difference was leadership visibility, leadership communication, leadership empathy. So, understanding the difficulties of trying to work from home with children at home, recognizing that they didn't have all of the answers, understanding how individuals might be feeling, but then also starting to signpost some decision making and clarity about the future going forward. But I think if ever there was an example of that empathy combined with just the short term, okay, how do we mobilize a workshop force that's currently found itself working from home overnight? How do we change our retail stores into COVID secure and safe places? What are the protocols for sending engineers to people's homes? So, fantastic example of being empathetic, but also doing busy work, now work to focus people on the short term. And then equally, as that organisation is now coming out of the pandemic, they're using employee listening again to understand attitudes to working from home in the future. And again, there's lots of questions about how we'll go back, when we'll go back. But those two elements of being empathetic, understanding how people feel, being honest about what you do and don't know, and then just focusing people's attention on practical things that can be done. Great example of disciplined care in action.
So I think at this point, to summarise, Donna, if we're saying that really the challenge facing leaders prior to any type of change is to ensure that they try and keep their teams focused on the present and continue to operate as efficiently as they can. And then at the same time, offering them empathy and understanding, care and involvement. Would you agree that summarises what we've discussed today?
Yeah, so it's really important that as soon as you're aware of any change, be it at an organisational level or a local level, it's about thinking about what that's going to mean for your team, how they might be feeling, demonstrating empathy and support, and really focusing their attention on the things that they can control in the short term.
Absolutely. And such an important part of this whole change cycle. Thank you very much, Donna. Thank you for joining us today with some really interesting insights on the topic. And thank you all for listening. I hope you're enjoying the Mindset Advantage podcast series. Stay tuned for more episodes.
You've been listening to The Mindset Advantage. Follow Arcadia Consulting on social media platforms to stay updated.